This is the Generation Report. I am Paul Zimmy Finn. Hope you're doing well. In the spring of 1983, right as Michael Jackson was dominating the music charts, a special report published by the National Commission on Excellence in Education made its own headlines. While today that report is remembered for its pointed criticisms of American education during that time and for the changes to schools which followed it, the appeal to the future, a nation at risk, delivered in its conclusion, was equally meaningful. Children born today, it read, can expect to graduate from high school in the year 2000. We dedicate our report not only to these children, but also to those now in school and others to come. It is their America and the America of all of us that is at risk. The acute sense of concern expressed in A Nation at Risk cast American education as the ultimate decider of where America's future would ultimately go. And what is that future looking like 38 years later? Consider another special report published just March 2nd, this one jointly funded by the Department of Education and the National Endowment for the Humanities, but which has made far fewer headlines. Its title is Educating for American Democracy, and its essence comes through in these excerpts. A self-governing people must constantly attend to historical and civic education, to the process by which the rising generation owns the past, takes the helm, and charts a course toward the future. Generations of students have not received the high-quality education in history and civics that they need and deserve to prepare them for informed and engaged citizenship. Fraught though the terrain is, America urgently needs a shared national conversation about what is most important to teach in American history and civics, how to teach it, and above all, why. It seems that in the years between Thriller and COVID, the sense of urgency expressed in A Nation at Risk went unheeded where it was needed the most. In 1992, Francis Fukuyama wrote the following in The End of History and the Last Man. History is not a given, not merely a catalog of everything that happened in the past, but a deliberate effort of abstraction in which we separate out important from unimportant events. The fact that the objects of historical attention have shifted from the rich and powerful to those lower down the social scale does not imply the abandoning of standards of historical selection, but merely the changing of standards to fit a newer and more egalitarian consciousness. It would be hard to find a better summary of the dominant contemporary approach to history. However, since Fukuyama is officially a political scientist, we should consider what he wrote in the 1990s alongside what historians have said on the record about their profession more recently. To that, here is part of a professional conduct statement from the largest organization of historians, the American Historical Association, or AHA, released in 2019. Practicing history with integrity does not mean having no point of view. Historians hold this view not because they believe that all interpretations are equally valid or that nothing can ever be known about the past. Quite the contrary. History would be pointless if such claims were true. Everyone who comes to the study of history brings with them a host of identities, experiences, and interests that cannot help but affect the questions they ask of the past. Clearly, an emphasis on personal points of view and a focus on particular identities have infused the study and scholarship of history for some time. As for the teaching of history, recall that Educating for American Democracy professed this year that quote-unquote generations of students have not received a high-quality education in history and civics and declared a national conversation about the subjects to be an quote-unquote urgent need. Among contemporary historians, many of those who write the most acclaimed books of popular nonfiction and widely read textbooks for class instruction present their work as nonpartisan when on closer inspection it seldom if ever is. Curiously, at the same time enrollments in advanced placement U.S. history and government courses have risen significantly over the past decade or so, the number of history majors on college campuses has fallen sharply. And if there were any doubt as to the extent of the ideological uniformity among history professors in contemporary academia, I recommend that anyone interested check out Gad Saad's excellent book, The Parasitic Mind. To summarize, the dominant approach through which history has been studied, formally researched, written, and taught has not led the discipline in a constructive direction, for education, for students, for serious scholarship. Yet, as this approach to history has failed to stem the decline of the discipline as a whole, the partisans committed to using history to wage ideological battles have assumed the power to fundamentally rewrite it. From Thomas Sowell's Intellectuals and Society. The behavior of those who follow the vision of the anointed has long included certain patterns. They tend to see themselves as advocates of change and their opponents as defenders of the status quo. They often see issues in terms of crusades and their vision as something to protect. In short, what must be attacked is our society, to be subjected to the particular change favored by the intellectual elite. Society's sins, past and present, must be the focus. Where do events lead in the present when the study of the past approaches the tipping point of becoming consumed with sins and little else? It seems we are in the midst of finding out. At this recording, America is experiencing a war over history. To put it in the broadest terms possible, the two sides in this conflict are those who hold our shared heritage, for all its obvious flaws, in high esteem, and those who believe our shared heritage is fundamentally flawed because it is demonstrably imperfect. Each side has called the other side's assertions of its point of view a war on history, and the likelihood of an amicable compromise appears effectively nil. The coming to a head of this impasse amid the worst political divide since the Civil War, at the same time concerns are being raised about the place of civics in education, is no coincidence at all. For the political divide, the concerns about civics, and the war over history all reflect upon the same fundamental issue. After decades of ratcheting up the culture wars, injecting everything with political meaning, and retreating ever further into cocoons with like-minded people, Americans can no longer come to basic agreement on what kind of country we are. Could any of this have been foreseen back in 1983? Possibly, if a critical distinction had been understood. When A Nation at Risk invoked the high school class of 2000 in its conclusion, it spoke to the sea change then taking place in American attitudes toward not only education, but children as well. It is no accident that the millennial generation started being born amid the anxieties which emerged in the Reagan years. Since the beginning, millennials have been shaped by aspirations for a better future in the face of deep concerns about America's future. For that reason, A Nation at Risk is an indispensable part of the millennial story. From first cohort to last, from preschool through graduate school, the millennials' entire educational experience has taken place in the years following A Nation at Risk. But what few foresaw in 1983 was that a generation which in time would prove so adept at meeting standards would not, as a whole, match its credentialed achievements with an equivalent level of informed patriotism. The critical distinction is this. No amount of credentialed achievement can compensate for a widespread ambivalence toward American institutions or a mostly downcast outlook on American shared heritage. And the millennial generation was shaped by an education system and a culture in which the overwhelmingly dominant perspective toward America and its history has been the vision described by Thomas Sowell. We can see the impact nearly everywhere. If America was at risk back in 1983, that speaks volumes about the level of urgency we are facing now. So what lies ahead in the war over history? I can only give general predictions, but here are a few things I believe are on the horizon. First, despite educating for American democracy's affirmations that it has generated bipartisan support and its stated goal of making American K-12 schools civic-ready by 2030, it will not come close to achieving its intended impact. My reasons, all of which are connected. Battles are already being waged in too many communities in too many states over history and civics in school, and in those places, the focus on recent introductions to the curriculum is overshadowing everything else. The ideological gap between parents, whose partisan affiliations reflect the differences among the American public, and administrators and teachers, whose overall partisan affiliations do not, stands almost no chance of narrowing. In fact, I expect it will increase. In view of the Biden administration's stated commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I anticipate they may eventually impose some form of penalty on states that have passed laws forbidding the teaching of critical race theory and related concepts, which will inflame partisan tensions even further. In general, the partisan gap in the country is already too great to be resolved amicably in a fashion that will enable educating for American democracy to achieve what it sets out to do. Second, as the tech giants of Silicon Valley expand the reach of their diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, more traditional voices on American history will regularly face deplatforming and censorship simply for being more traditional. Third, as higher education commits more and more to diversity, equity, and inclusion platforms and related scholarship, those who favor a more traditional approach will all but disappear, not only among professors, but among students. Fourth, the teaching of American history will be a major issue in the 2022 midterm election cycle and in all likelihood the 2024 election cycle. However one might assess the situation, the war over history is one more spark inflaming the divide in America, and the chances of a harmless burnout are not looking good. On another matter, although I have refrained from expressing positions on issues directly connected to politics, in view of the general topic here, I would be remiss if I did not address critical race theory. I have read a reasonable amount on both sides of the issue, including Ibram Kendi's book. I am against the teaching of critical race theory, as well as other mandates that fall under the banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion in history and civics in American K-12 schools. Acknowledging wrongs committed in both the past and the present, responsibly and where appropriate, is something every American of good conscience should do. I agree with the position Tom Hanks stated in the New York Times last month that events such as the Tulsa Massacre of 1921 should be given their due attention in the classroom and out. In history, as in life, there is always more to learn, and America can always be made better. I also agree with Ben Shapiro when he wrote last year, American history is a story of triumph of freedom over the tragedy of human nature, the victory of liberty over slavery and bigotry. As a millennial, I have seen how the dominant approach to American history has not only contributed to ambivalence toward Americans' shared heritage, but to disdain for America itself. What is being taught in classrooms today, if it continues much further, will make the problem orders of magnitude worse. If yet another generation grows up even more convinced that identity determines destiny and America is fundamentally not a good country, then our future will resemble some variation of what British author Douglas Murray described in The Madness of Crowds. Ensuring that such a future does not come to pass should be everyone's concern. And in order to ensure that, one indispensable thing we must do is appreciate American history for the shared heritage it gives us and for the lessons it provides us, again. What steps can be taken? First, we can heed the words of one of America's great historians, Victor Davis Hanson, and show gratitude for what previous generations gave us. Everything about the way we live today was made possible by Americans in the past. They may not have been perfect, but neither are we, and the people who come after us, they won't be perfect either. We need to uphold our responsibility to those who come after us, just as those who came before us did. Second, we need to have more conversations about American history, all aspects of it, in our day-to-day lives. As long as discussions of American history remain mostly confined to classrooms, documentaries, short news segments, and political speeches, the appreciation of its transcendent value will only diminish further. Third, we must recognize that history's transcendent meaning stems from one simple truth. It is the story of people. Few ever understood or communicated this better than someone who became widely known in the aftermath of a nation at risk. In 1984, as a demonstration of the nation's redoubled commitment to education, President Reagan announced that a teacher would be the first ordinary citizen on board a forthcoming space shuttle mission. And in the summer of 1985, shortly before I was born, NASA selected a high school history teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, described by her students as an inspirational human being for that mission. That history teacher was Krista McAuliffe, and like the rest of the crew of the Challenger, she gave the ultimate sacrifice in the service of her country. Countless ordinary Americans who gave their lives serving our country did so because they believed in the impact they could make on the American story and because they believed in what America stood for. So should we all. Fourth and finally, every American should be familiar with the insights of William Strauss and Neil Howe and their 1997 book, The Fourth Turning. History is cyclical and seasonal, and just as history creates generations, generations create history. It is critical that Americans understand where we are in the cycle of history so that we have the best possible chance at successfully navigating through the difficult months and years ahead. It is essential that we appreciate the role generational differences are playing in our day-to-day lives and in the events happening around us. And it is crucial that we recognize the role generational change has played in the story of America all the way through to the present day. It matters that the generation born just after the American Revolution and the ratification of the Constitution was the generation most responsible for leading America into the Civil War. It matters that the cultural upheavals of the 1960s occurred as the generation born too late to remember World War II was beginning to come of age. It matters that A Nation at Risk was published at the time when millennials were beginning to be born. It matters that the history and civics lessons of today are mostly being taught to the generation after millennials. And it matters that millennials are the generation in young adulthood today, in the same phase of life in the same season of history as the GI generation was a lifetime ago. History matters because, as President Franklin D. Roosevelt stated in the summer of 1936, there is a mysterious cycle in human events. To some generations much is given, of other generations much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. In closing, I want to thank everyone who has listened and subscribed to the channel. This has been a demanding project, and it has been your enthusiasm and support that has enabled me to take it this far. I will be taking a little bit of a break from the podcast before I return with new episodes. In the meantime, if you enjoy this series, I hope you will share it with someone important to you. I hope you all have a great 4th of July. May God bless America.